Kitco News special coverage of the New Orleans Investment Conference is brought to you by Discovery Group.
All right, point very well made, George. I do now want to circle back on the second threat that we discussed at the top, and that is the potential collapse of the banking system, which could usher in this CBDC. Because take a sip of water. You have been warning about this, and you said that you actually think that the banking system will collapse in March of next year.
Yeah, it will, unless they step in and do something.
And you refer to the Bank Term Funding Program as the reason you can give such a specific date for that.
Yeah, so let's just go back to March 12th of 2023. So that was Silicon Valley Bank. That was First Republic, that was Signature Bank, and what most people forget, a big one out there, Credit Suisse, right? In fact, their central bank or their central authorities just came out and said how systemically important Credit Suisse actually was, and if they would not have bailed them out, that would have created like a GFC type of scenario. Those were their words, not mine, right? So we have to go back to that date and ask ourselves, what would have happened if the Fed would not have stepped in? If they would have said, you know what, we've found religion and we're just going to let the free market do its work. We're going to let Schumpeter's creative destruction take over. What would have happened to the banking system? I think the majority of your viewers that are watching this right now would say, well, George, in that case, yeah, I mean, the system probably would have collapsed. We probably would have had a GFC 2.0. Well, okay, fine. And by the way, I'd like to remind all your viewers that if you look at the assets on the balance sheet or the size of the balance sheets, we actually had more banking failures in 2023 than we had in 2008. So I don't know how people can say that wasn't a crisis, right? Or that we're somehow over the crisis, like a nothing burger. How do you figure?
We had more banking failures, you mean that were prevented by being saved by the Fed, the FDIC being prevented by...
No, absolute banking. If you look at the total assets, the size of the balance sheets that went bust in 2023, even when you adjust for inflation, that exceeded the level that we saw in 2008. So how that wasn't a banking crisis, I don't know. But let's just assume for a moment, like we said, that the Fed would not have done anything. You're telling me that we would not have seen the exact same systemic risk that we saw during the GFC 1.0? Absolutely we would have. And I think that would be the base case for most people watching this. But what they don't realize is that program technically is only temporary. It ends March 11th of 2024. So people might say, oh, George, well, that's fine, but now this banking crisis is behind us. So even if it ends, we've got nothing to worry about. Well, that's where you're wrong, because you need to look at the utilization. Going back to March of 2023, the utilization of that BTFP went up to, call it, I don't have the chart in front of me, but it was right around $65 billion, okay? So now everyone thinks that we're past that point, where the Fed came in and solved all the problems, and now there's no more banking crisis that we need to worry about. But if you look at the BTFP, now it's up to 108 billion as far as the utilization. So the utilization is almost twice as much today as we speak than it was during the height of the banking crisis in March of 2023. So my point there is, if it's being utilized more and more and more, that means that there's a lot more risk within the system. So if you just rug pull that BTFP, you're going to have the exact same scenario that we would have had in March if the Fed wouldn't have rolled it out to begin with.
So why would the Fed and the Treasury not just continue with this? Why would they not extend it?
Well, let's think about what Jerome Powell's trying to do.
Yes, he is trying to reduce liquidity in the markets to bring down inflation.
He's trying to bring down inflation. He wants to be remembered as Paul Volcker. Now, I'm not saying...
He should have let those banks fail in March, because that would have taken care of that.
You took the words right out of my mouth. So let's think about what would have happened to the rate of inflation if you would have let those banks fail. Yeah. We would not have seen disinflation. We would have seen outright deflation, some proper deflation. We would have seen a 1930s type scenario. Now, I'm not saying this is what he wants to do or what he will do, but I'm saying this is something that people really need to think about. When they watch my videos, that's what I encourage them. They think that I make all these predictions, and I really don't. The main intention for me coming on Kitco News or doing my videos is just to warn people of the risks. It's not really to
Highlight
make predictions
yeah.
and let them come to their own conclusions based on probabilities. There are no certainties. But if you're in Jerome Powell's shoes and you can't get the rate of inflation down to 2%, you know that these darn banks are creating all these currency units that are leading to aggregate demand, that are preventing you from being the next Paul Volcker and increasing the probability that history is going to remember you as the next Arthur Burns. So you know that you've got this switch right here, that all you have to do is, I'm going to flip that switch up, no more BTFP come March 12th of 2024, and you know that your inflation problem is gone.
But replaced by what? Replaced by a banking crisis, which means what? Which surely means a recession, surely has broader ramifications.
And surely means a...
Well, no, inflation.
CBDC.
Well, yes, well...
And surely means a CBDC.
When you... Well,
so there's that incentive layer on.
When we were talking in March, I had several guests on the show that actually predicted or forecast or made us aware, like you do, of the possibility of a consolidation of the banking sector, which allows for a CBDC. Fewer banks there are, the closer you are to the Fed, the easier it is to implement a CBDC.
Even if it's not the Fed's balance sheet. Let's just assume that all the banks got absorbed by JP Morgan. So you've got the Fed and JP Morgan. Well, let's remember who owns the Fed. That would be JP Morgan, that would be the banks. Yeah. So if there's only one bank, then they own the Fed, right?
The banks own the Fed?
Absolutely. Yeah, the Fed technically is a private corporation,
right?
And they have shareholders.
Yeah.
And the shareholders are the banks that are within their network, in their system, right? So if there's only one bank left standing, then by definition, they own the Fed. Right. Okay. So basically you have that Gauze bank type of scenario that we talked about earlier, which was the one bank in communist Russia that could not go bust. So whether that one ledger is on the Fed's balance sheet or JP Morgan's, it still doesn't matter for the average Joe and Jane. The net result is the exact same.
So there is incentive for the Fed to stop funding this program, to stop the bank term funding program, to bring down inflation very, very quickly, reset the system in a way, cause the collapse of several banks, allowing for consolidation of banks, which takes us a step closer to implementing a CBDC, and even potentially engineering the crisis needed to implement a CBDC, saying, look what happens, you kept your money in the bank, they failed, but here, we have a different system where you go directly to the Fed, which is what you were explaining earlier.
Yeah, it checks a lot of their boxes. And again, that's not my prediction. My base case would be that the Fed will extend it, that they'll come out and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and extend this BTFP. But it's not 100%. I think that there's some serious incentives as to why they wouldn't. It's definitely on the bingo card.
It's on the bingo card. Not necessarily high up there, but on the bingo card. I'm not sure that how you rank on a bingo card matters where you are on the card. It's been a while since I've played bingo. What can I say? But you mentioned Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan. And perhaps coincidentally, or not coincidentally, we're learning that Jamie Dimon, for the first time, is selling 1 million shares of JP Morgan.
$140 million worth.
$140 million worth. This is about, I think him and his family own 8.6 million shares. So this represents about a 12% stake of his overall holdings in JP Morgan. He has been using the ownership of his shares for several years as a vote of confidence in JP Morgan. In the SEC filing, they said that, this is no reflection on...
Of course. What are they going to say, right?
But what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that, this is to happen in early next year, because when you have that many shares, you've got to say in advance when you're planning on selling them. And, JP Morgan shares doing exceptionally well. What do you make of the fact that, this timing sort of coincides?
I think it's a huge red flag. I don't know how you could take it any other way. Because let's just go through that thought experiment that Jamie Dimon is retiring and he wants to cash out some of his chips and whatnot. Okay, look, if you were very bullish on JP Morgan and the overall banking system, why would you sell those shares? Who cares if you're retiring? Wouldn't you still want the greatest return on your savings that you could possibly get? And if you felt that was the best risk reward, then why on earth would you sell?
Arguably, just to play devil's advocate, he needs the cash to buy his beautiful beachfront retirement home.
Borrow against the shares. Then you don't have to pay taxes.
interest rates are higher. I'm not saying what he's going to use the cash to pay, for maybe not a house where you have some tax incentives. I don't know.
Yeah, just borrow. That's what rich people do.
Yeah.
Is they borrow against their assets so they don't have to sell those assets and absorb the capital gains. So that would be my rebuttal. That would be the highest probable outcome, or the highest probable motivation behind him taking that action if your devil's advocate case was actually the truth. But I think that, again, if I'm just using common sense, my base case would be that he sees a massive red flag. Look, and let's look at some of the other data points. We've got a curve that's massively inverted, for heaven's sakes. Yes, we've had a bear steepener as of the last, 2 or 3 months, but we still got the 10-year trading at, call it, 50 basis points under Fed funds? It's 40 basis points under reverse repo. That is a huge, huge sign that the health of the global economy is very, very poor right now, and it's getting worse. You look at what's going on in Europe. They're in absolute recession. You look at what's going on in China. They're on the brink of collapse, for heaven's sakes. And if that happens, I don't know how the US avoids that. So, and then plus, you've got the BTFP that we were talking about. You don't think Jamie Dimon knows about that?
Sure he does.
Absolutely. So he's sitting there looking at all of his buddies in the banking system, and they're sitting there saying, holy cow, I don't know what is going to happen in 2024. The stuff could absolutely hit the fan. And then he's looking at history, and he's seeing that, oh, wow, every single time we get an inversion, let's say the 3-month and the 10-month, or excuse me, the 3-month and the 10-year, we usually have a recession, not months afterward. No. Usually it takes at least 18 to 24 months before the stuff actually hits the fan. You go back to the inversion that we had prior to the GFC. I don't have the chart in front of me, but if my memory serves me well, the curve actually inverted in 2006. And we didn't have all that stuff happen until the middle, let's say, of 2008. This stuff never happens overnight. It always takes a long time to play out. So let's say 18 to 24 months. So Jamie Dimon is well aware of this. So he's sitting there looking at his share price, maybe looking at retirement. I don't know. I think he's more so looking at how do I take some of my chips off the table so they're not subject to a complete crash in the overall system and the share price going down by, who knows, 70, 80%. I think that's more the incentive here. And even if that doesn't play out, he realizes that there's a very high risk of that happening. So why not be on the defensive when you're 67 years old?
And there are also huge geopolitical risks and tensions, which Jamie Dimon himself highlighted. He recently said that this period might be one of the most tumultuous the world has encountered in recent memory.
Yeah.
So
you've got the inversion of the curve. You've got potentially World War III, which those things aren't good for the banking system, right?
Those things aren't good for the world, but yes, but the banking system.
That ain't good for the banking system.
Yeah.
So I'd be doing the exact same thing that he's doing, and I think it makes absolute sense.
Which brings me back to the question of what should investors potentially be doing to position themselves for these events that you say they need to be aware of. You're not saying they're definitely happening, but are on your bingo card, to bring it back to that. What is a move? What is your personal move? Yeah,
so let's just for a moment shelf the having purchasing power outside the system, because that's just a given. In today's day and age, you have to, whether it's gold, silver, Bitcoin, whatever your monetary unit of choice is, if not all three, you've got to have that outside of the system. So assuming someone has done that, then what I'm doing in my own personal portfolio is I just set it up in what I call a 10-80-10. So 10% of it is just physical gold. That's just the insurance policy for the
physical gold, like right. Bars, coins.
Yeah, so that's the insurance policy for the amount that I have invested. And that doesn't include actually the stuff that I have for purchasing power outside the system. That's completely separate. That's just when I look at my portfolio. Then the other 80% is what I would categorize as an investment. And that's my definition of that is something that pays me to own it, right? And then the other 10% is just a speculative asset, which I think there's good asymmetry. So an example right now would be in fact, the personal portfolio that I have for my membership site. It's 10% gold and it's 90% US treasuries. Short term though, that's very, very key. So when I say treasuries, a lot of people's head explode because they look at the rate of inflation. I completely agree with them. that there's a lot of risk to the long end of the curve, a lot of interest rate risk. But when you're buying a 1-month treasury T-bill, when you're buying a 3-month T-bill, you don't really have any interest rate risk there, because even if you need that liquidity, you can just hold it to maturity and you're getting paid 5.5%. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the yield curve, looking at history and saying, okay, we've never had a soft or no landing before. So the likelihood that we have it now is very, very low. And when we do have the stuff hit the fan, usually what comes down, ironically, is something that I want to buy long-term, and that's commodities. Because I think that we're in a commodity super cycle. I think that almost everything that we talked about, whether it's a CBDC, what's a global elite, that leads to supply of commodities going down, which means the price goes up. So if I can get a temporary buying opportunity as a result of a crisis, recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, that's what I want to be set up to take advantage of. And I set that up through having that dry powder in those T-bills, which are massively liquid, and I'm getting paid 5.5% on.
So you're not buying commodities now, you're waiting for the crash. You're waiting for...
Another way to say it is I'm just waiting for the yield curve to play out, because that's what the average Joe and Jane can do. They don't have to have a PhD in economics. They don't have to know or follow any of this stuff. Just every single morning, every single weekend, just pull up a chart of the 10-year, pull up a chart of the 2-year. And when you see the 10-year yield go above the 2-year, or especially like Fed funds, and stay there for a period of time, then you know you're really close to the stuff hitting the fan, because the stuff always hits the fan after the curve uninverts. So you wait for the curve to uninvert, you see what happens, then you take action.
Wait for the curve to invert, then uninvert.
Uninvert. No. The curve's inverted right now.
Okay, yeah.
So you wait for the curve to uninvert, because historically, going back to 1950, the recession doesn't happen. The stock market doesn't crash or whatever until the curve is no longer inverted.
Right, that 2-year period that we talked about between 2006 and 2008 as the indicator.
Yeah,
so
and the curve usually inverts as a result of the Fed dropping rates, and they're doing that because they see a crisis. And that's usually when you have the major drop in the S&P 500 and commodity prices, sometimes even in gold. So you sit back, wait for the curve to uninvert, you see how it plays out, you wait to see what the central planners do, you wait for what the crisis is, then you evaluate, you see what gets cheap, then you take your dry powder in the form of T-bills, you cash that in, and oh, by the way, while you're waiting, you're getting 5.5%. And then you go ahead and buy what you want to buy long-term on the cheap.
And there's, well, I guess no concern that you won't be able to sell those T-bills.
There are no certainties, there are only probabilities, but if you couldn't sell your T-bills, that would be the least of your concerns, because we'd be living in caves eating canned goods, as Jim Rickard says. Right.
Which brings you back to gold, arguably. T-bill and chill is your advice for 90%?
Gold, gold, T-bill and chill,
10% in physical gold. So zero exposure to equity markets right now. From absolutely.
Not for me.
Yeah. Completely out of the equity markets. Not even companies that would benefit from commodities soaring. You're going to wait to get into that market.
Correct. Yeah, I'm just very content waiting and doing nothing. My favorite investor of all time is Jim Rogers. And the first time I ever heard of him, it was in the Market Wizards books. And one thing that he told Jack Schwager, as far as because Jack Schwager was looking for all these complex strategies that Jim Rogers would employ. And Jim looked at him, he said, well, basically all I do is I just sit and do nothing. And I wait for a big pile of money sitting in the corner, and when I see it, I go pick it up. So that would be my advice to all your listeners.
Okay. All right. Well, we've had Jim Rogers on the show a few times, and he always likes to say the greatest lesson of history is that people don't learn the lessons of history.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully they've learned something from you today. I know I certainly have. So thank you so much, George. Really appreciate it. George Gavin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And as always, thank you for watching Kitco News, coming to you from the New Orleans Investment Conference. Make sure to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, and stay tuned for the rest of our coverage.
Kitco News special coverage of the New Orleans Investment Conference is brought to you by Discovery Group.